Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're discussing the unsolved mystery of Dorothy Jane Scott. This has been unsolved since May 28th of 1980, and it seems like we're no closer to getting any answers. Let's begin. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April 23, 1948, to Jacob and Vera Scott in Anaheim, California. In 1976, she gave birth to her son, Sean, and the father of Dorothy's child wasn't really in the picture, and from what I could find, he lived somewhere in Missouri. So Dorothy, a single mother, moved to Stanton, California to live with her aunt along with her son. Dorothy did rely heavily on her family to help her out with raising her son and asked them to babysit when she needed to go to work. But she had a great relationship with them, so it was never an issue. She worked 2 jobs, one as a back office secretary at a psychedelic shop that sold lava lamps, love beads, and things like that. And the other was John's Head Shop, which is a store that sells paraphernalia for smoking, so bongs and lighters, and sometimes gas stations have these small sections where you can find this type of stuff. And from what I understand, these 2 shops were connected or affiliated with each other, but Dorothy worked in the office, so she didn't really interact with the customers. Dorothy's parents also didn't live far from where she worked, so it was very, very easy for her to bring her son there. And some accounts say that Jacob, her father, co-owned these shops that she worked at. Friends would say Dorothy was a homebody. She preferred hanging out around the house rather than going out to parties or social gatherings. She was a devout Christian, didn't drink or do drugs. She was also close to her parents, and her dad would say that she didn't date much either. He recalled maybe 1 or 2 dates here or there, but she never had a steady relationship. She didn't seem interested in finding love and focused her time and attention on raising her son and going to church, as she was a devout Christian. Before Dorothy's disappearance, she was receiving some really strange phone calls at her aunt's house where she lived. The caller would sometimes profess his love to Dorothy, and other times he seemed really angry and threatened to kill her. One of these phone calls really shook Dorothy up, as the caller was being quite graphic. She would tell her aunt what the caller had said, which was when he gets her alone, he was going to cut her into bits so no one will ever find her. Another time he called and told Dorothy to go outside because he had something for her, and she actually went outside to investigate it, and she found a single dead red rose on the windshield of her car. It was clear that whoever this caller was watching her and stalking her. He knew where she lived, he knew her phone number, and it was really, really creepy. Strangely, Dorothy mentioned that she almost recognized the voice. It seemed very familiar to her, but she couldn't quite pinpoint who it was. She was increasingly getting worried and talked about buying a gun and signed up for karate lessons so she could defend herself. Nobody really knew what to do since they didn't know who was behind these calls. So they just carried on as best as they could. Some accounts say that these calls were never reported to the police, but I've also read that the police were informed and didn't really know what to do about it because back then, stalking wasn't really that well known. Then on May 28th, 1980, Dorothy would go to work and also had to attend a staff meeting in the evening that started around 9 p.m. When she dropped off Sean, she informed her parents that she would be home really late because of this meeting. During the beginning of this meeting, Dorothy and another coworker named Pam Head would notice that their friend and coworker, Conrad Bostron, didn't look well, and he had a strange red mark on his arm, which resembled a bite mark or a spider bite. Dorothy and Pam decided to leave the staff meeting to take Conrad to the U.S. Irvine Medical Center. Just before going to the medical center, Dorothy wanted to swing by her parents' house where her son was to tell them her change of plans. While there, she also changed a scarf she was wearing from black to red. She informed her parents she'd be home later to get her son, but wanted to help out her coworker first, and off they went to the ER. It was later determined that Conrad was bit by a black widow spider and he was treated for the bite. Dorothy remained with Conrad and Pam in the hospital, where she mostly read magazines and watched television while they all waited. Around 11 p.m., when Conrad was discharged, Dorothy left to go get her car from the parking lot and told her friends to meet her at the exit. While Dorothy was getting her car, Pam and Conrad filled a prescription that Conrad needed for his spider bite. Conrad would say that Dorothy didn't come back with her car for some time. To him, it seemed like she was taking way longer than it should, so him and Pam walked outside to see if they could spot her. It was then that they saw Dorothy's white station wagon driving towards them. They weren't able to see if Dorothy was driving because the headlights were pointing directly at them and it was obscuring their vision. They did wave their arms to try and stop the car, but that didn't work. Whoever was driving the car didn't stop for Conrad and Pam, and instead they took a sharp right turn out of the parking lot and left them standing there. While they thought this was odd, they came to the conclusion that Dorothy must have had an emergency with her son and had to leave in a hurry. Some accounts say that Conrad and Pam waited there for a few hours to see if she'd return, but she never did. They would then call Dorothy's house and discovered that she never actually made it home at all. It was then that the difficult decision was made to phone the police and report her missing. This was very out of character for Dorothy, and it seemed like she had just completely vanished. A few hours later, at 4:30 a.m., her car would be found burning in an alley about 10 miles from the hospital in Santa Ana. Dorothy was not found in her car and was never heard from since. The police wondered if Dorothy had been kidnapped, and seeing that her car was burned, they were very, very concerned. Back in the 80s, stalking wasn't really a well-known crime, or even a crime at all. People often brushed it off and weren't aware of the real dangers in having someone follow you and obsess over you. Dorothy's stalker wasn't her ex or anyone in her immediate circle of friends, so it was very confusing for her family. This person knew when and where Dorothy was at all time, what she was wearing when she went to work that day, and it was very, very eerie. About a week after Dorothy's disappearance, Dorothy's mother, Vera, would start to get really strange phone calls, presumably from the same person who was calling Dorothy. The first call was from a man asking if she was related to Dorothy, and then the caller simply said, "I've got her," and hung up. These calls would continue, typically on a Wednesday and typically when she was home alone. Dorothy's mother truly believed that it was the person responsible for Dorothy's disappearance. He knew things like the color of the red scarf she wore even after she changed it, and he knew that she was at the hospital that night. Police requested that her parents not speak to the media because it could potentially hinder the investigation. But Dorothy's dad, Jacob, would lose his patience and asked a local paper to run a story on his missing daughter. The story ran on June 12, 1980, in the Register, an Orange County newspaper. And that same day, the newspaper editor, Pat Riley, received an anonymous phone call from someone claiming to be Dorothy's killer. He would say, "She was my love, and I caught her cheating with another man. She denied it, so I killed her." He also had details the newspaper never released, like what she was wearing the evening she went missing, and that Conrad had a spider bite that needed attention. Unfortunately, this caller was never identified. Some of the customers who frequented the head shop where Dorothy worked were also questioned, but Dorothy worked in the office and never really interacted with the customers. So that sadly didn't turn up any clues either. The caller would end up phoning Vera for over 4 years. The caller would claim Dorothy called him from the hospital, but Pam and Conrad would refute that as she never left their sides. Sometimes he said he loved Dorothy, and other times he'd ask for Dorothy and then hang up. And these calls would always end up leaving everyone confused and angry. Dorothy's parents never changed their phone number or blocked the caller because deep down they hoped that one day he would allow them to see Dorothy again or would give them information that would help them find her. On April 1984, the caller would call the house in the evening this time, and Vera's husband answered the phone. The caller would say, "Is Dorothy home?" and hang up. The calls then suddenly stopped for over 4 months. And the police wondered if the caller knew Jacob and if they were worried that Dorothy's father could recognize his voice. Sadly, on August 6, 1984, Dorothy's remains were found. A construction worker discovered the bones of a dog and human bones side by side about 30 feet from Santa Ana Canyon Road. The bones were partially burned and looked like they had been there for quite a long time. After finding a turquoise ring and confirming the dental records, it was found that these these remains were of Dorothy Scott. The watch Dorothy was wearing had also stopped on May 29th at 12:32 a.m., which would have been an hour after Pam and Conrad saw Dorothy's station wagon speed out of the parking lot at the hospital. Unfortunately, the coroner also wasn't able to determine the cause of death, so the family were still left with no answers. Nobody knows why she was buried with a dog either. She had never owned a dog. Police thought that they had been there for at least 2 years because a bushfire had swept through the area in October of 1982, and that could explain the charring on the bones. After Dorothy's body was found, the caller called again, asking for Dorothy one last time. This case has gone cold, and nobody has ever been charged with Dorothy's murder or kidnapping. Dorothy's father died in 1994, and her mother Vera passed away in 2002. Sean, Dorothy's son, has had to grow up without knowing who murdered his mother or why. While I was researching this case, the name Mike Butler came up a few times. It's rumored that some people suspected a person by the name of Mike Butler, who was a mechanic that worked across the street from the head shop Dorothy worked at. Mike's sister also worked with Dorothy, which could explain how the caller knew her schedule. From there, he could have easily gotten her phone number and stalked her. He was said to be a bit of an oddball as well, but I'm not sure exactly what people mean by that. The police never identified Mike as a suspect, and Mike has since passed away in 2014 and was never arrested in anything in connection to Dorothy. Dennis Terry, the father of Sean, Dorothy's son, was also ruled out right away as well. My thoughts? I don't really know. This case happened so long ago, and there isn't really a whole lot to go on. I feel like it was definitely someone who knew Dorothy. He was able to stalk her without being noticed. His disguise was no disguise at all. He was just able to hide in plain sight, and no one ever suspected him. I think the Mike Butler theory is very interesting. He possibly could have gotten Dorothy's phone number from his sister who worked with Dorothy, and it said the caller knew of Conrad's spider bite as well, which could have been information his sister had shared. Maybe she came home from the staff meeting saying Conrad has a bite, and Dorothy and Pam had to rush him to the hospital. I do find it curious that Dorothy worked in a head shop, even if it was in the office, based on the fact that she was quite religious. And then finding out her father was a co-owner just seems weird. Not a shop I'd imagine a devout Christian would be involved with, but maybe I'm just being judgmental. I'm not saying her father had anything to do with this, but perhaps the clientele or client may be someone involved. As far as we know, this thing hasn't happened to anyone else in the same town around this time. So did the killer move away, or was he content with just hurting Dorothy and moved on with his life? What do you think happened to Dorothy? Was it Mike Butler, a customer at the head shop, or was this just a stranger who had an infatuation with Dorothy? That's it for today. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and we will see you again soon.